When you bring up Chuck Norris, I bet most of us think of Walker Texas Ranger first. That is not by accident. It was not just a hit show. For a whole lot of people, that was the clearest, strongest, and hardest to replace image of Chuck Norris. But the strange thing is, it was only after that legend came to an end that people really started looking at Walker more closely. And the closer you look, the more you realize this show was never just a simple action series with cowboy hats, pickup trucks, and roundhouse kicks. Because behind it was a whole world a lot weirder than most people ever imagined. A family primetime series once brought an adult film actress right into the frame. A television monument that looked rock solid almost died before it even made it to air. And that is only the surface. These are the 20 weirdest facts about Walker Texas Ranger, and the more you hear them, the stranger this legend starts to feel, compared to everything you thought you remembered. Number 20. The legend almost died right before showtime. There is something about Walker Texas Ranger that still makes me laugh and shake my head every time I think about it. This is the show tied to Chuck Norris as the man nothing could knock down. And yet, in real life, this very series almost collapsed before it ever stepped into the light. Just 10 days before the premiere, Canon Television suddenly stopped production because of financial trouble. Meanwhile, CBS had already locked in 13 broadcast hours, while the production side at that point only had enough material for the 2-hour premiere and a few early episodes. Put simply, they had already invited the audience to the table, but the kitchen in back was still not sure it could even serve dinner. And that is what makes this story so good. We tend to think that success was inevitable, but it was not. Right there at the starting line, this show was dangerously close to the edge. And maybe that is the old Hollywood thing I have always loved. Sometimes a legend does not begin with certainty. It begins with not dying. And trust me, the real origin of this series is even stranger than that near collapse. Number 19. Walker's real roots are not what audiences usually think. A lot of people remember Walker Texas Ranger like it just appeared out of nowhere on television. In 1993, Chuck Norris put on the hat, climbed onto his symbolic horse, stepped onto CBS, and from that point on, America had Walker. Sounds reasonable enough, only the real history is not that neat. Walker was not adapted from some famous novel, and it was not some idea that fell out of the sky. Its closest DNA comes from Lone Wolf McQuade, the 1983 theatrical film that also starred Chuck Norris. And to me, that is where the story really starts getting interesting. Because once you know that you see Walker completely differently, it stops feeling like some random television miracle. It starts feeling like a Chuck Norris hero model that had already been road-tested, then brought over to the small screen, trimmed down, cleaned up, and made steady enough to enter the living rooms of millions of American families every week. That is what is so great about old Hollywood. They did not always invent a completely new person. Sometimes they just took an old shadow, raised it slowly, and let the whole country believe it had always been that way. And once you see that foundation, you understand why Chuck Norris did not just say yes to any show. Number 18. Chuck Norris did not choose randomly, and Walker was a rare exception. There is one detail about Walker Texas Ranger that I have always found incredibly interesting, because it tells you exactly what kind of star Chuck Norris was. He said he turned down a lot of television offers, simply because most of them were just routine cop shows where you could watch one and already know where the rest were headed. But Walker was different. It was one of the very few projects that made him stop and say, all right, this one is worth doing. What Chuck Norris saw in Cordell Walker was not just a guy chasing criminals. He saw a very old, very American kind of hero, the kind of thing you get with John Wayne or Gary Cooper. A man who does not go looking for trouble just to look cool, but if trouble comes his way, he stands right there and handles it. Honestly, that is exactly what gave Walker its own smell. It did not feel like an ordinary cop show. It felt like an old western that got swapped out for a badge, a pickup truck, and martial arts. And when an image gets built, that carefully all it takes is one person trying to place it somewhere unusual, and the whole machine behind it starts getting nervous. Let me tell you, fact number 17 about one thing CBS was worried about. Number 17. CBS did not want anyone to see Walker as vulnerable. In a series built around the image of Chuck Norris standing firm like a stone pillar, there was one idea that sounded risky. The second you heard it, let Walker go down. And what makes this story even better to me is that the person who pushed that door open was not some outside writer. It was Cherie J. Wilson herself. She did not just stand in front of the camera as Alex Cahill. She also co-wrote an episode where Walker falls into a coma and the people around him sit there, look back, and remember how they met and how they became the very specific kind of family this series created. Now just put yourself in CBS's shoes at that moment, and you can instantly understand why they were uneasy. According to Wilson, the network did not like the idea at first because they did not want their superhero to look too vulnerable. And honestly, I get that. When audiences are used to seeing Chuck Norris as the man who always gets back up, just the idea of him lying still in a hospital bed is enough to make a few people at the network break into a sweat. And yet, that episode still got made, and from Wilson's memory, it ended up becoming one of the strongest rated episodes, exactly because it showed audiences where the heart of that group really was. And speaking of who had to carry the most misery in that world, Walker himself might not even be at the top of the list. Number 16. The one who suffered most on Walker was not Walker. Take a guess who went through the most disaster on Walker, Texas Ranger. Walker. Sounds reasonable. He fights, chases people down, gets into shootouts, takes hits, like it is part of breakfast. But no, the real answer is Alex Cahill. And once you take a closer look, it is both funny and a little cruel in that very 1990s American TV kind of way. Over the course of the series, Alex was kidnapped and held hostage 22 times, shot 3 times, and drugged 1 more time. At that point, I have got to be honest, that is not normal bad luck anymore. That is a side job. Every time the writers needed to raise the tension, it feels like somebody just looked around the room and said, "All right, let's put Alex through hell again." And speaking of people who stepped into this world and left behind an unbelievable story, trust me, the next one gets weird in a very different way. Number 15. Walker's strangest casting choice was an adult film actress. If there is one thing that can make people sit straight up when you mention Walker, Texas Ranger, this has got to be a strong contender. One of the strangest casting choices in the whole series involved Monique Parent, an actress associated with adult films, and this was also her first appearance on primetime television in Season 4, Episode 12. That detail alone tells you just how weird the American entertainment world can get sometimes. What makes the story even better is Monique Parent's own reaction. In an interview, she joked that after years of making what she considered pretty decent money from low-budget movies, light horror, and light comedy, she suddenly felt like she was being paid incredibly well on Walker. And the funniest part was, what exactly? This time she made more money and did not have to take her top off. I have always thought this was such a perfect old Hollywood collision. A clean, family-friendly primetime show accidentally became the place that opened up a career turn that sounds almost impossible when you first hear it. Number 14. Texas almost made Walker its own show. Some productions just borrow a place for scenery. Walker, Texas Ranger was different. It did not just film in Texas. It almost feels like Texas itself put a hand on this series and held it up from beginning to end. And honestly, the more I learn about the behind-the-scenes side of it, the more I think that is one of the things that made Walker feel different from the other action shows of its time. The crew used all kinds of Texas local infrastructure to make Walker's world feel real. They used roads, vehicles, locations, and even administrative support. At one point, the production was even given priority access to buy state-confiscated vehicles for crash scenes and chase sequences. At times, they got help shutting down roads for larger shoots. There was even a period when the crew was allowed to film inside a state prison until that got tightened up after a real-life prison escape. Number 13. CD did not just disappear, he left Hollywood to go into politics. There are some faces in a long-running series that feel so permanent, you just assume they will be there forever. On Walker, Texas, Ranger CD was one of those people. He had that old Texas father figure presence, always sitting there like a fixed part of the world, warm enough, tough enough, and solid enough to make Walker feel like he still had a place to come home to. So, when Noble Willingham left the show in 1999, it did not just surprise people. It sounded like the kind of turn only America could come up with. He did not leave the show to rest. He did not walk away for another role. Noble Willingham left Walker to run for the United States Congress. Honestly, that sentence alone is weird enough. An actor playing one of the most deeply Texas father-uncle figures on television suddenly stepped straight out of the screen and into real-world politics. Number 12. The Walker song everybody remembers was not the original one. There are some series where you forget half the plot, but the second you hear one melody, the whole show comes rushing back into your head. Walker, Texas Ranger is one of those. Just hearing the title is enough for a whole lot of people to almost hear Eyes of the Ranger playing somewhere in the back of their memory. There is only one small problem. The song everybody remembers was not actually the show's original opening theme. Early on, Walker used a different opening theme composed by Turk Wilder. It was not until the middle of Season 2 that the opening got replaced with Eyes of the Ranger, composed by Gerald Immel, and tied to Chuck Norris's performance. And I have got to say, this is the kind of thing old American television used to do really well. They quietly changed the face of a series halfway through, and the new version hit so hard, it basically swallowed the old one whole in the audience's memory. Number 11. Walker had a code, and Chuck Norris wrote it. If you want to understand what Walker, Texas Ranger really was, do not start with the kicks or the chase scenes. Start with the things Chuck Norris refused to let this show become. That is the interesting part. He did not just stand in the middle of the frame as the biggest star on the show. He also built the fence around it. Chuck Norris wanted Walker to be a program families could sit down and watch together, which meant danger, conflict, action, sure, but it could not slide over into cruel violence, or the kind that takes pleasure in itself. And that is why Walker always felt so different. While a lot of action shows from that same era wanted everything darker, meaner, harsher, just to seem more grown up, Walker went down an older and straighter road. The good guy had to look like a good guy. Evil was not allowed to be more attractive than what was right. Walker could throw hands, but he was never allowed to turn into the kind of man who fights just because he likes fighting. Number 10. Clarence Gilyard Jr. is why Walker never turned flat. Everybody remembers Chuck Norris first. That is totally normal. He was the central face, the shadow hanging over the whole series. But shows that last a long time usually do not survive just because of the person in the middle of the poster. They survive because of the person who knows how to keep that star from turning into a block of stone. In Walker, Texas Ranger, that person was Clarence Gilyard Jr. What matters is he did not walk into the show as some brand new face. Before becoming Trevette, Clarence Gilyard Jr. already had Matlock, Top Gun, and Die Hard behind him, which means he understood television rhythm, understood how to stand next to a big character without disappearing. And that is exactly what he did in Walker. Trevette was not just the younger partner there to round out the team. He was the talking rhythm, the reaction rhythm, the everyday rhythm, and the part that kept the show from getting so serious it went stiff. Number 9. Walker did not run on one man, it ran on a whole machine. If there is one star audiences are willing to believe did everything himself, from the roundhouse kick to the shot, where he comes charging through smoke and fire, it is Chuck Norris. And I get that. Just looking at him standing in frame makes people want to believe it. But the truth behind Walker Texas Ranger was a whole lot more professional than that. This show did not run on the legend of one man doing everything. It ran on a full action machine with stunt coordinators, fight coordinators, and stunt doubles. What I really respect is exactly that. Behind the scenes, material shows, there were set pieces where Chuck Norris and his stunt double both appeared so they could catch all the right camera angles, which means that unbeatable feeling audiences saw on screen did not just come from Chuck himself. It also came from a crew that knew exactly what to do to keep that legend standing week after week. Number 8. Walker got dragged right into America's TV violence war. There was a time in America when people argued hard about how violent television had gotten what kids were watching and how tightly the networks should be reined in. What I find both interesting and very pure 1990s about it is that right in the middle of that fight, Walker Texas Ranger got pulled under the spotlight. A Saturday night show, a face like Chuck Norris, a series that always wanted to protect a family image, and still it got mentioned in a much bigger conversation about violence on screen. That is exactly where the Walker paradox sits. Chuck Norris always defended the series as a show with a clear moral center, where violence had limits and the good guy knew why he had to act. But at the same time, the show still had way too much fighting for America to just ignore it. By 1997, when the TV rating system changed its rules, CBS even used Walker itself to explain the line between TV PG-V and TV 14V. That detail alone says everything. Number 7. Dodge on Walker was almost as famous as the cast. When people talk about Walker, they do not just remember Chuck Norris, the cowboy hat, or the roundhouse kicks. They remember what was rolling down the road with him, too. Dodge and Chrysler vehicles showed up in this series so often that honestly they almost felt as permanent as the supporting cast. But the detail I love most is what happened in real life. There are reports that customers would walk into dealerships, point at one, and say it exactly like this: "That is the one Walker drives." Once it gets to that point, it is not normal product placement anymore. It is practically part of the image itself. Just one vehicle, but it pulls along that whole old America feeling. Road dust, hot sun, Texas, the modern cowboy, and that sense that the hero has to be driving exactly that vehicle, or the whole thing does not feel right. Number 6. Walker borrowed child actors from the world of Barney. If there are two television worlds that sound like they should never touch it, is Walker Texas Ranger and Barney and Friends. On one side, you have Chuck Norris, Texas Criminals, and Roundhouse Kicks. On the other side, you have a Purple Dinosaur Kids songs and an atmosphere soft as cotton. And yet, the funny thing is, those two worlds were not as far apart as audiences might think. A number of child actors who appeared on Walker had already passed through Barney and Friends before that. To the audience, those are two completely different universes, but to working actors, especially in Texas back then, it was just casting calls, familiar faces, kids who one week might be standing next to Barney and the next week stepping into Chuck Norris's world. Sounds ridiculous, but it is true. Number 5. In the show, he was Marine Corps in real life. Chuck Norris was Air Force. Some roles fit a star so perfectly that audiences start unconsciously blending the character with the real man. Chuck Norris in Walker Texas Ranger is exactly like that. He stood in the frame so solidly, so disciplined, so much, like a man who had lived in the military all his life, that it was easy to assume every detail in Walker's background must line up with real life too. But not quite. In the show, Cordell Walker had served in the United States Marine Corps. In real life, Chuck Norris had served in the United States Air Force. On the surface, that sounds like just a small difference. But I have always loved details like this, because they remind you that Hollywood is really good at creating that feeling of course, it had to be that way, even when real life was not written exactly like the screen version. Number 4. Chuck Norris stood in front of the title, but not at the top of the cast credits. If there is any series where everybody is ready to believe Chuck Norris stood at the top from beginning to end, it is Walker, Texas Ranger. Just the fact that his name appeared right before the title of the show was enough to make audiences assume no need to even check. This is clearly Chuck Norris's territory all the way. And honestly, that feeling makes total sense. Every eye got pulled toward him. Every piece of the show's identity turned around him. This series was sold on his shadow. But here is where it gets interesting in the opposite direction. Even though Chuck Norris's name appeared before the title throughout the whole run, the name actually listed first in the cast credits was Clarence Gilyard Jr. In other words, Walker did not just make Chuck Norris look like the absolute center. It made audiences believe it so strongly that almost nobody stopped to really look at the credits. And the farther you get toward the end of this series, the clearer one thing becomes. Sometimes just one decision from Chuck Norris was enough to send the whole ship in another direction. Number 3. CBS was not ready to end it, but Chuck Norris wanted to go home to his family. Hollywood loves cold endings. Ratings slide. The network gets bored. Somebody pulls the plug, show is over. It sounds neat, industrial, and familiar. But Walker, Texas Ranger did not leave the screen that way. After season 8, CBS actually wanted to keep the show for 2 more years. In other words, this ship had not been pushed away from the dock at all. The network still wanted to keep sailing. The only thing was the man standing in the middle of that ship was looking in another direction. At that time, Chuck Norris's wife was pregnant, and in the end the series did not continue for the extra stretch CBS wanted. I have always thought this was one of the strangest facts about the whole show, because it suddenly makes a television monument feel very human. Not a scandal, not a behind-the-scenes war, just a man looking at life outside the screen and deciding what mattered more. And really, that fits Chuck Norris perfectly. A man who had tried to keep Walker rooted in family values for years ended up being the one who stopped it because of family. To understand how heavy that decision was, you have to remember one thing. Walker was not fading into the background. It got hit hard by critics and still stayed healthy enough to become a real pillar for CBS. Number 2. Critics tore it apart, and Walker still became CBS's ace. When Walker, Texas Ranger first premiered, plenty of people had practically already declared it a loser. To critics, it was just a show that was too straight, too old, school too thick with cowboy flavor to ever be considered stylish or sharp. It sounded like the kind of thing that would flare up for a second and disappear. But American audiences saw a totally different story. The 2-hour premiere pulled a 16.5 rating and a 27 share, beating the competition in its time slot. That was not a lucky break. That was the first answer back. Then, the show just kept grinding forward. By the end of the 1993 to 1994 season, Walker ranked 47 out of 128 primetime series with a 21% share, and keep in mind it aired on Saturday night, which was never an easy slot to survive in. From being looked down on, it gradually turned into a real pillar for CBS, to the point that later, the network itself called it an unsung hero. And that is when this story really gets good. Because a show that wins, that stubbornly, should have left the screen only after time finally knocked it down. But Walker did not. Let's get to the final fact on today's list. Number 1. Walker did not get knocked down. It walked off the screen like a winner. Most television series do not get a beautiful ending. They run out of steam, get shortened, get moved around by the network, then quietly disappear before the audience even realizes they just watched the last episode. Walker, Texas Ranger did not leave that way. By the time it reached 2001, the audience numbers were not at the same peak as before, but it was not collapsing like some abandoned show either. Chuck Norris said it very clearly the decision to stop was his own, and he wanted to leave while he was still a winner. Honestly, I cannot think of an ending that feels more Chuck Norris than that. Not waiting for someone else to tell him his time was up. Not sitting there until the legend started shrinking. Picking the right moment, standing up and walking out of the frame while his shadow was still intact. And maybe that is the most beautiful thing about looking back at Walker, Texas Ranger today. That legend may have closed along with Chuck Norris, but the work itself is still there, quietly standing in the memory of generations like a very specific corner of golden age American television. What I have always loved about shows like Walker is that the more you think you already know them, the deeper you dig the stranger, richer and more human they become. The weird facts around this show do not make the legend smaller. They make it more alive. They remind us that behind that unbeatable image was a whole world built out of choices, personality, conviction, and turns nobody saw coming. That is why going back over these things is not just about telling behind-the-scenes stories for fun. It is also a really beautiful way to keep Walker alive and keep Chuck Norris alive in public memory, not just as an icon, but as a real part of a time that is gone now. If Walker, Texas Ranger was ever part of your younger years, this is the moment to tell that story again. But there is something interesting about the shows that live the longest in our memories. The more familiar they feel, the easier it is to think we already know everything about them. But behind it, there is an entire layer of backstage stories that many viewers have never heard. So today, we are heading back to Hazard County and uncovering the most fascinating secrets behind the Dukes of Hazzard. And trust me, a few of them may make you see this series in a completely different way.